Good afternoon and welcome to this America Saves YouTube live broadcast in honor of America Saves Week. I'm your host, Carol Kaplan. Thanks for joining us. America Saves is a nationwide campaign conducted along with about 2,000 partner or participating organizations across the country to get Americans to open a savings account or at least increase their savings on a regular basis. Every day of America Saves Week has a theme related to personal savings, and today's theme is to save for the unexpected. We all have those occasions when something unexpected happens and we need quick access to cash. So let's say your car breaks down, your pet needs an operation, your dishwasher overflows, or maybe you just want to take a vacation at a discounted cost. Well, these events are all part of real life, but when you don't have savings set aside to pay for them, that's when you can get into real financial trouble. So this is where I bring in our special guest today, New York Times personal finance writer Ann Carrns. Hi, Ann.
Hi, Carol.
So I've got some questions for you today, and to our viewers, get ready to submit your questions. We'll get to them in just a few minutes. Now, Ann, you have been writing for these issues for many years now, so let me ask, when did you first become aware of the need to have money set aside for unexpected expenses?
Well, first, thanks again for having me. It's a nice opportunity. I guess I have a kind of an embarrassing story I can share. When I was a young reporter, right out of college, I worked for a small newspaper, and I don't really have that much of an excuse because my parents were savers. I was taught to save at a young age, but this was really the first time I was on my own, managing money, without family or even really close friends around. I was sharing an apartment with other young women, and things got a little out of hand financially, and I found myself without enough money to buy gas for my car. So I sort of limped along until payday, and then I drove to the bank to get cash to fill up my car. And I thought it would be faster for some reason to get into the drive-through teller lane, which I guess those are still around. They were probably more popular back in the day, but as I was waiting in the line, the car in front of me had some sort of issue, and I just was sitting there, and minutes were ticking by, and I began to panic, thinking I was actually going to run out of gas in this drive-through bank line. The cars behind me would be stuck, and it would be a big fiasco. So I turned the car off, and thank goodness the car ahead of me moved and my car started. I was able to get my cash and fill up my car, and the story had a happy ending. But I remember that sort of made an impact on me, that you really need to have money set aside or a cushion in your checking account, in case something comes up. So that's my story.
Okay, well, we can all appreciate the anxiety you were going through at that time. So we know that the savings rate right now, the personal savings rate, is at 6%, which is pretty low. So was there a time when Americans saved a lot more than we do today, and what changed?
Yes, 6% is the current savings rate as calculated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. These numbers. It's not as good as it used to be. Back in the 60s and 70s and well into the 80s, the personal savings rate for Americans was about 10%. It was generally stayed in double digits around those times, 10% or even higher. So it's dwindled since then, and there's a lot of debate over why that has happened. I can go through some of the causes if you'd like. Economists point to slower wage growth, which makes it harder for people to meet expenses.
We hear that a lot.
Left over, higher housing and healthcare costs. There's even more recently behavioral economists that I've spoken with have talked about the fact that it's actually easier to spend now. They call it frictionless spending, where you are using a debit card or a credit card or even tapping your phone to pay, using a P2P service to send money to friends. It's just a lot easier to spend than it used to be, which is a good thing in some ways, but it can be more difficult for people who are trying to spend less and save more.
Sure. So what advice do you have for Americans who we hear all the time are living paycheck to paycheck?
Well, I think we talked earlier about a Federal Reserve statistic where I think about 40% of Americans said that they couldn't come up with $400 in cash to meet an emergency expense. So it suggests that a lot of people are struggling. It's hard for them to save. They don't have money when they need it. So the old rule of thumb used to be that you should have an emergency reserve fund of maybe 3 months of expenses, or even as many as 6 months. But many financial advisors I talk to, particularly those who deal with working Americans, suggest that that's sort of overwhelming for many people. That's too big a goal to start off with. And they prefer to suggest that people start small. Maybe even set a goal for saving one paycheck or $500, some sort of manageable goal that seems easier for them to start achieving, basically.
All right. So now you've talked to a lot of people who are good savers. Is there a common thread that runs through their behavior that we could learn from?
There's many people I've spoken with. There's a great program run out of NYU, it's partly run out of NYU, called the U.S. Financial Diaries, which follows working class people and how they do or don't save money and manage their finances. And I spoke with a couple of people who I met through that program. And one thing they had in common was that they sort of tried to make it a game, or they tried to make it fun. So often savings just seems like this sort of drudgery that I have to save money. And one woman said what she did was to sort of put little hurdles between herself and her money. She opened a savings account at a bank branch that was across town. So it wasn't something she drove by every day. She wasn't tempted to go in and take the money. She declined a debit card for the account, so she would have to actually physically go into the bank to take out her savings. Another gentleman I spoke with, he was pretty funny. He saved money, but he gave it to his mother. He was an adult, but he gave it to his mother to save for him, so that he knew if he had to go get the money, he would have to explain to her why he needed it, and it better be a good reason. So, of course, you need to have a family member that you trust if you're giving them your cash. But those are sort of some approaches that worked for them. And along the lines of keeping things fun, another couple I spoke with more recently in Chicago used a goal of setting what they call frugal February. A lot of people use that term, where they sort of cut back and try and get back on track financially after the holidays. And they would do silly things like she and her husband would collect loose change around the apartment, and they would try and cook a meal using only the money they had collected from loose change, to set sort of little, fun challenges like that can help make it less of a chore to save the money.
All right. So we want to take some questions from the audience. And one of the questions that we get, and I'm reading this question that came in from Julie. She says, I have about $5,000 on a credit card. I'm paying 15% interest. But if I put my money in a savings account, I'm only going to get about 1%. So doesn't it make more sense to pay off the credit card debt first?
Well, I would say on the first question, Interest rates are getting somewhat better now. It used to be sort of depressing to put money in a savings account because you really wouldn't get much back on your money. Particularly now with online banks, if you're comfortable with that, you can get certificates of deposit for maybe, you know, a year, 2 years. If you go as long as 5 years, you can get 3% on your money. Now that's tying up the money for a while, but even with shorter term, a year or two, you could get 2%. So that's something to think about. In terms of paying down the credit card debt, that's certainly something that you should think about, and there's different approaches to do that. Some people suggest tackling the smallest balance card first, make the minimum payments on the other cards so you're not hurting your credit score or getting behind, and just put your extra money toward the smaller balance and pay that off, and that will sort of give you momentum to keep going. Another way to do it is to just tackle the largest balance first, because that's the one you're paying the most money and interest on. You know, you can, again, keep making the minimum payments on the other cards and just tackle that big balance. And it, you know, it really doesn't matter which approach you choose, but you really should choose one, because that interest will just add up.
Yeah, for sure. So do we have any questions from the audience?
We do. Somebody just asked about whether you should pay down debt or save, which
we just talked about.
Covered that one, so
right.
That's good. And then we have a question: does what you contribute to your retirement count towards the 6% that Americans save each year?
That's a good question. Did you hear that, Anne?
I believe that percentage is what's left after spending and taxes. So that probably, I'm not entirely sure of the answer to that question. I apologize, but it sounds like that probably does include what you would put away for saving.
Okay. Well, in America Saves, we've learned that one of the first things that someone needs to do to become an effective saver is to make a commitment to save. And that's why we have created the America Saves Pledge as a tool to help create a simple savings plan. So what you do is, if you go to americasaves.org and click on the button that says Take the Pledge, you're going to start getting support from America Saves, ongoing support, resources, and hopefully motivation to stay on track. So would you say that there are some best practices? I know you touched on this a little bit when we talked about people that are really good at saving, but are there so-called best practices for saving?
Sure. When I speak with financial advisors, one thing I hear over and over is the best thing to do, if you can, is to automate your savings. If you leave it to yourself every week or every 2 weeks, however often you get paid, to remember to take this money and put it into your savings account, you know, you're going to set yourself up for failure. You can, you know, if you bank online, it's very easy to set up an automatic transfer from your checking account to your savings account. If you're not comfortable doing that, you can ask you can go to the bank and ask them, or your credit union, and ask them to have the money transferred automatically. They can do a split deposit, for example. If you have an automatic deposit of your paycheck, it will just automatically, part of it, however much you want, will go to the savings account. There's also, if you're a technology comfortable person, there are new apps that you can use on your smartphone that will transfer money automatically. I haven't used these, so I'm not really endorsing them, but I have spoken with people who've used them. There's one called Digit that sort of rounds up your purchases, I believe, and transfers that money automatically in very small increments. There's another one called Capital, which lets you set certain goals. So there are ways to help you put the money in savings and make sure you're sort of paying yourself first before that money just gets spent on, you know, whatever you're spending.
One thing I read about those apps is you've got to beware on whether they're free or if there is some sort of fee or subscription associated with them.
Yes, you should be very careful about checking what fee is involved. And also, most of them, when I read about them, at least this may have changed, as interest rates have gotten slightly better, most of them don't pay interest on the amount that is shifted into the savings component. So if you're looking to save an emergency fund, your real target shouldn't be necessarily to earn the most interest on your money. You're trying to set aside a pool of cash that can be there if you need it, so you don't have to turn to a high interest credit card or another source for the money. But it would be nice to earn some interest on your daily.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, if somebody says, well, I have $5,000 set aside in a CD, does that count as an emergency fund?
Well, it certainly can. I mean, people use all sorts of what's called mental accounting, as financial advisors call it, or behavioral economists, economists. I'm having trouble speaking that word for some reason. If you have that money in a CD, that can be your emergency fund. Now, typically with the CD, there's a penalty if you withdraw it before the term of the CD. It might only be 1 month's interest, which is probably not, a big problem. And that actually might help you to leave it alone until you actually need it, knowing that there's a penalty if you do withdraw it. But sure, I mean, what I would say is an emergency fund needs to be accessible if you need it, but not too accessible so you're tempted to just spend it.
How do you feel about money markets?
I don't necessarily recommend one product over another. Wherever your savings is, it should be a safe, easily accessible pool, preferably, FDIC insured, so you don't have to worry about that.
Right. But the point is that you don't want your money tied up in something that's intended for emergencies that you can't get your hands on immediately. Like having money tied up in real estate, may be counted towards your overall financial wellness and build wealth, but it's not good in emergency because you're not going to be able to pull cash out of it really.
Right. Most financial advisors would not consider real estate to be, liquid enough to be an emergency fund. For, a longer term, possibly, but not something, if your car breaks down, you're not going to be able to sell your house fast enough to buy a new car. I wouldn't think so.
And what about the temptation when you've got the money set aside in an emergency fund, and you say you're in a store and you say, oh, I love that dress, but I don't have the money in my checking account right now. I could just pull a little bit out of my emergency fund. How do you deal with temptation like that?
Well, I guess, using, again, what I've learned speaking with behavioral economists, one way to sort of do that is to visualize your goal or visualize what might happen if you don't have that emergency fund. Sort of picture yourself broken down by the side of the road with a car that you can't get repaired, or your heater going out in winter. Sort of those little mental games with yourself.
So you mentioned goal, and that is the part of the America Saves theme. That we say the first thing you want to do is make a commitment, take the pledge to save. The second thing is that you want to create a goal, whether it's $1,000 emergency fund, a vacation fund, or enough to buy a new refrigerator. It doesn't matter what the goal is as long as you have one. And the third step is to make a plan to save. So how are you going to get there? Will you reach your goal by setting aside $50 each pay period? And if so, maybe your plan should be to have an automatic deposit into a savings account, which you mentioned. And I want to thank you, Ann Carrns, personal finance writer from the New York Times. Be sure to check out her column in the New York Times. And that's all the time we have for today. Be sure to take the pledge at americasaves.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'm Carol Kaplan. Thanks for joining us. Remember, start small, save big with America Saves. Have a great day.
Thanks.